Really see you all. So if you could share the kind of introductory slides. And just go to, yeah. There we are. So welcome all. Thanks for being back, and great to be hosting another Forest School talks, lunchtime talks. And today we have two wonderful speakers and another film contribution. If you click to the next slide. Today theme is Constructive Land, and we've invited James Simpson from Forestry England and Summer Islam from Material Cultures. And the next series of talks will directly engage with Forestry England and their staff and practitioners, researchers, and bring that knowledge from the English forest to the table. And we are teaming this up with in-house designers and artists, and also colleagues from White Architecture, our partner in this project. So next slide, please. The Forest School is a bigger initiative across the MA in Architecture and Spatial Practices program and the Knowledge Exchange program at Central St. Martin's to build partnerships that take the forest as a starting point to look at art and design, to design with empathy to the forest, but also with empathy to living systems. And there's a series of projects that are developing in the space. One of them is these forest talks and forest school talks, lunchtime talks. And there's other projects sitting in it, and you can see it on our website. The piece that Summer is presenting today, the research with Material Cultures, is one element to it, which among others. So please, next slide, check it out. It's a kind of growing resource, the website of talks, of resources, films, videos, etc. You can also see the previous Forest School talks on the website, but also this talk will be recorded and will be uploaded there very soon. Next slide. And of course, you can join our our mailing list. We will host a series of talks this term, but hopefully they will go into the summer, into next year. So it's for us, it's a kind of ongoing commitment to work with Forestry England, but also to work into the kind of forestry practices in the UK. So next slide, please. I've mentioned it already. We have two wonderful speakers, James and Summer, and they will present their practices. And we also have a 5 or 4 minute introduction and interlude from Arborescent News, graduates from the MArch who's dedicated quite a lot of work to the forest. And it's also a good moment to thank our partners. So I've mentioned Central St. Martin's already. White Architecture from Malmö is here with us, and they've kindly supported this project. And there's a kind of an ongoing relationship developing across the UK and Sweden in how to work together into this field. And of course, Forestry England is a growing partnership of work with what they're doing across the UK. So I stop here. Maybe just one big shout out, my new friends. Next slides. We've been to Dalby Forest yesterday. We met wonderful curators, and Emily, Louise, and Petra. That's the site for our new project, which Summer is going to talk about, but it's also been a real pleasure to actually leave Zoom behind and go visit one of your sites. So that's been brilliant. So I wanted to just give them a shout out. I don't know if they're in the call, but if there are, it was wonderful, and we're looking forward to be working with you. On that note, I hand over to Zoe to play the film, and then afterwards to James, and then on to Summer. We have an hour, and then we have to bring it to a conclusion fairly quickly, but there will be time for questions and conversations. So thank you all very much, and I hand over to you, Zoe, to play the film.
Ecological challenges within our landscape. Today on Forest School Talks, they ask us to consider why forestry and land management are relevant and how we can adapt as designers to existing future ecological challenges within our landscape. Exciting. Hello and welcome to Arborescent News. Today I'm joining you from a smart Pahone. What connectors and interesting devices of the 21st century. Quite synonymous with our mycelial networks. However, I must say they stink of extracted rare earth elements. Their carbon footprint is quite heavy. And the average production of one of these phones would take a tree seedling 10 years to sequester the same amount of carbon. The thrills of capitalism, eh? Anyhow, on today's news segment, we shall be cooking with Key. We shall be learning how to make some tree bark paint pigment. First, delicately break the bark off and place into a little muslin cloth along with a couple of cloves. Using a pestle, gently crush the tree bark to refine the tree bark elements. Then add a bit of salt and a bit of iron sulfate. In a little spray bottle, add water and a couple of tablespoons of vinegar. Then add some tree sap, a little bit of gum arabic, Now I shall enjoy my time in the sun with a spot of painting. I encourage you to do the same. Thank you for cooking with Key. No trees were harmed in the making of this pigment.
Here we go, our little kind of intermezzo from Key. Thanks so much. And I would like to invite James.
Thank you very much. First of all, a big thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. It's a real privilege. I'm going to try and keep this brief. And I could speak for days because I'm a bit of a bore being a forester. I could go on and on about trees, but I just thought I would hone it down to why you should care, or why I think you should care about forests and forestry, and to hopefully stimulate some good discussions from that. I don't know if you've thought about it or not, but every one of us, certainly living in the UK, has an impact on forests. We consume stuff, all sorts of stuff. We live in houses, we consume things which we keep, like books. We consume things that we throw away, like toilet roll, food cartons. And it's an interesting fact that the UK is the second largest net importer of forest products in the world. So by and large, we are offshoring our environmental impact big style in the UK when we consume forest products. It's not all about the very obvious stuff, bits of wood, the bits chopped up wood, the bits of solid wood. The deforestation issues in the world for the 20th century and the 21st century are more about agriculture than they are about forestry. That's about forests being removed so there are spaces to do different sorts of productive activities. The picture here is a palm oil plantation in Indonesia. You can see the very even, uniform layout of that next to the remnant of a bit of native forest beside it. The other things that you'll have heard a lot about over the years, production of beef in Amazonia. That has taken out a large portion of the Amazon rainforest to make space really for soy production and space to keep cattle that are fed on that soy. And that produces everything from your Big Mac to your cat's breakfast. So that was just a little bit of a reminder about why forests should matter to you, even if they're not the forests you see every day, even if they're not the forests in a country you've ever been to. Still be having an
James, sorry to interrupt. To interrupt, the audio is fading in and out a bit.
Oh.
And I can't judge whether it's you and your microphone or whether it's a connection issue.
I'll try and stay up close. Is that better?
That sounds good at the moment.
Okay, yeah. I'll stay up close. Yeah. So, what is forestry anyway? Forestry is just the art and the science of managing trees, woodlands, and forests. And that's for the broadest range of objectives that you could think of, whether they're commercial or not. So really, forestry is just a means to an end, and that end is delivering the objectives that you've decided that you want for a particular area of land. Who decides on the objectives? Well, in the UK, it's most often the owner or the manager of the land where the forest, the trees, the woodland is. And those owners, those managers of those woodlands, they may manage mainly for financial gain, or they may manage for more altruistic reasons, perhaps for biodiversity. But it's also true, particularly in the UK and Europe and North America, and many places around the world, that because forests, trees, and woodlands are so valued and they take such a long time to establish, and their removal creates such a long-term impact, that society around the world in many countries also decides what those objectives should be. So in the UK, as a for instance, to cut down any number of trees outside your garden, you'll need a license to do that. So there's a bit of law that says you need a license. If you want to plant an area with a new woodland, make something new and special and covered in trees, actually you're going to also need an environmental impact assessment to make sure that the things you're covering over with trees aren't more valuable than the trees you want to put there. Thinking a bit about the value of forests, and particularly what we in Forestry England are thinking about. And I should add at this point, in case I should have started with this, but Forestry England are basically the managers of the UK, of the English government's, Westminster government's forests. So we're managing the forests on behalf of the government for the benefit of the public in England. But natural capital, you might have heard of. It's a concept which has become talked about a lot, certainly in the 21st century. And it's basically all the world's stocks of natural assets, including the geology, the soil, the air, the water, and all the living things in the environment. And it's from this natural capital that humans derive a range of services, and they're often called ecosystem services. So we are managing our forests in Forestry England with the headline that we're trying to increase their natural capital asset value. So we're trying to increase the value of the things there, not just the things that we can sell and trade commercially, but the things that we can't sell, like clean air, clean water, biodiversity. And there's a little plug for Dieter Helm's book there, Natural Capital, in case any of you are interested to follow that up. The ecosystems services provide that wide range of benefits for society. As I said, productive soil, carbon sequestration. They also provide spaces for humans to relax, to find well-being, just to be away from the places that they may find stressful. And just as using Forestry England estate as an example, we manage 253,000 hectares. We're the largest land manager in England. And I amused myself by working out that that was somewhere around 9.5 million tennis courts. I don't know how many Wales is, a fraction of a Wales. But it's quite a lot of land. And the last time we valued it, we do natural capital accounts every year, and the commercial value, if you like, of our estate is about £239 million. The total natural capital value is actually about nearly 33 billion. So there's a 14-fold difference between the commercial value and the total natural capital value. And even then, I would say that natural capital value is probably a bit conservative. So what should you do? Looping back to the start, why you should care about forests. You should care because you rely on them to provide stuff. If you're going to continue to use stuff, and I would say that's fine, as long as you source your stuff from sustainable forests, look for labels, look for credentials for the things you buy. And there's a few examples here: FSC, PEFC, Sustainable Forestry Initiative. Those are all certification brands, if you like, which give assurance about the quality of the forest management that went on behind the piece of forest, the piece of wood which you're about to buy from a shop. But also go as far as looking for other certification labels for the things which might touch places that have been deforested, or if they aren't well managed, they may pose a threat to deforestation, such as the Global Organic Textile Standard, Sustainable Palm Oil, and the various organic labeling standards around the world. Finally, it's not one we can certify. I don't have a standard which says forests make people happy, but we do ask people. And some of the statistics from the recent past are that 69% of the population, UK population, visited woodland in 2021, and 51% of the UK public experienced an increase in their level of happiness when they visited woodlands. So those things in themselves are good reasons why we should value forests, why they should matter to you, even if you don't personally go there and find yourself being happy in a forest. Lots of other people do. So it's a good reason to value them for the future. And finally, leaving you with a question, given all of the above and why they matter to you and why they matter to other people, it's a very interesting question. What should they look like in the future? And I think my parting thought on that is they need to look productive in all of their senses in spite of a changing climate. And that's probably the biggest threat that foresters and the rest of the world have to think about over the next 50 to 100 years in terms of forests everywhere, and certainly in the UK as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. I don't know if we do clapping or we can. There's some clapping in the background. I don't know if there are immediate questions to James. Otherwise, I think Summer's presentation will probably build quite nicely on this. So maybe we just segue into material cultures. Is that good? Thank you, James.
Yeah, thank you, James. That was really, really interesting, really great. And hopefully we have some common threads between our two presentations. Can everyone see the first slide? Great. Hi, well, I'm Summer. I'm a tutor on the MArch course, and I'm also a director at Material Cultures. And we're a not-for-profit organisation, and we, through our work, bring together design and research and action towards a post-carbon built environment. So we work at the intersection of architectural design and system thinking and digital technologies, material science. And we're interested in our organisation in the different scales of impacts the built environment can have, from the scale of the material and the impacts along its supply chain on the people who work to process and manufacture products, to the scale of the building and the impact that material can have on the quality of a home and the impact its language can have on the culture of our cities. And the scale of the landscape, where more often than not, the more destructive and extractive practices which serve the built environment are displaced elsewhere, out of sight and out of mind. The research that we're doing now has followed on from work we've been doing over the last few years to understand how our construction industry could contribute to radically lowering emissions, specifically through using lower embodied carbon regenerative construction materials, which last year we explored in this report. We collaborated with Arable in producing for the region of the northeastern Yorkshire. This is an area of the UK without much woodland cover, so we looked at the northeastern Yorkshire across the two regions of the UK, but that part of the country has significant areas of grazing land and arable farming, both land uses from which waste streams can directly supply the construction industry. In our research, where we looked at this part of the country last year, we found that a transition to a bioregional construction economy doesn't require significant changes to much existing land use. There are materials from farming land that we can build with, for example, and there's also substantial afforestation, which is already proposed in many areas. But there are different social and cultural expectations that we have of our woodlands. What's crucial is for us to develop productive woodland alongside national parkland, especially if we want to build with more local resources which are regenerative and have travelled shorter distances from extraction to site. So in our project this year in Constructive Land, which we're carrying out with the support of the SOM Foundation and the UAL, working in partnership with Forestry England, we've been exploring further what land uses and land management practices could be implemented to support a truly sustainable and regenerative construction industry, one which uses our finite resources with caution. So when we speak about regenerative resources, we mean materials and resources which can be extracted from cyclic processes of regrowth without reducing the capacity of that cycle to regenerate. So whilst we've long understood soil as a finite resource, we have often treated soil as an essentially infinite one. Regenerative approaches to construction are based on a different understanding, one that understands the soil as something which is finite and vulnerable to degradation through misuse. Soil is a living substance that can only continue to be used when it's nurtured and replenished. There are complex systems within our soils. About 25% of our biodiversity lives within them, and it's the largest terrestrial store of carbon. The way we manage our land and use our regenerative resources needs to change to one where our soils are treated as a resource which is as precious as our other natural capital. Our lands are in ecological decline, and if we need to build at all, we should do this using regenerative resources. And if we speak of forests and woodlands, only 7% of native woodland in Britain is in good ecological condition, and it's less than 1% if we speak about our kind of plantation woodlands, which is actually what many of Forestry England's woodlands are. So monocultural plantation woodlands like this, we speak of plantations, I guess we mean kind of planted with the kind of deliberate intent. These sorts of woodland can deplete our soils. They're nutrient hungry, and clear felling then disturbs the soils detrimentally. But this approach to timber production, growing lots of the same type of tree very densely, is driven by demand. And industrialization of forestry practices is driven by kind of a demand for high yields and fast-growing softwood timber cultivated in Sitka spruce plantations, a bit like this one, grown and managed to feed a very hungry construction industry. And these plantations are monoculture crops with limited biodiversity within their understories and no resilience in the face of climate change. If one tree goes down, the whole forest can go down too. This is an image of an infestation of bark beetles which destroyed vast areas of managed spruce forest in Bavaria. And so our question for the project we're carrying out now is, what would our landscapes look like if we plan our forests and forestry practices around the needs of the soil rather than the needs of industry? And what might our buildings look like as a consequence? Hopefully not like this, if we're lucky. So alongside students and researchers at Central St Martin's and a whole host of collaborators and stakeholders, we've been speculating on how you might plant woodlands today, which can provide resilient, biodiverse ecosystems, as well as acting as a potential source for regenerative resources. In this image here by Connie Beecham, looking at what forestry products you might extract over, say, 120 years from a mixed forest of oak, sycamore, hazel, spruce, and Douglas fir, thinking about not just hardwood timbers, but softwoods, even coppicewood, and their applications in construction. And to understand how our forest and forestry practices might change, we've also been exploring what resources we already have. So in the UK, only 13% of our land is dedicated to forestry. Less than half of the European and global averages of 37% and 30% respectively. So France, for example, has 32% forest cover. And the bulk of this land, of our forestry, sits within Scotland and Wales. You can see more of the green, at least in Scotland and Wales, which is essentially land which is less suitable for arable farming. And the rest is distributed in smaller woodlands across the country. And of that scarce and quite precious woodland, only 27% is in public ownership. So 73% of our woodlands are privately owned. And then again, of that privately owned woodland, only 17% of that is sustainably managed and in good ecological condition. So whilst we look to grow more trees, we also need better management practices and incentives for people to keep what woodlands we have in good condition. And with such limited resources, it stands to reason that we must import vast quantities of timber, as James said. We're the second largest net importer of timber in the world. And 81% of the timber that we consume as a country is imported. But this material is traveling really vast distances, and often the sustainability of the practices used to manage and fell that timber is very opaque, or at the very least, little understood. So the critical role that timber could play in decarbonising the global economy and achieving net zero, the question of how these demands are met is very pressing. If we look at how much timber we consume as a country annually, on the hatched area on the left here shows how much land our annual consumption of timber takes up if it was all Sitka spruce plantation woodland. But if you grew all those trees and cut them down all at once, we wouldn't have any trees left. So on the right, we show a 35-year crop rotation, how much land we consume by planting kind of new virgin timber every year. And so we're, for a small island, quite timber hungry. But in reality, we don't just consume softwood, we consume a mix of tree species, both broadleaf and conifer. And in the UK, our woodlands are a pretty even mix of both of these. Although most of the broadleaf woodlands are in England and the bulk of the conifer plantations are in Scotland and Wales. But within these two sorts of timber, the kind of hardwood and softwood, there's a whole host of different types of tree and lots of different timbers and trees that we are not familiar with as architects and specifiers. And they have different roles in ecosystems and applications and use. And our stock of broadleaves is quite varied actually, but our conifers are, well, there are fewer types of conifers that we grow at scale. And we need a better understanding, I think, as architects and designers of what our resources are if we're going to meaningfully engage with them. Nearly half of our conifer stock is made of Sitka spruce, for example, and 80% of this stock has been planted since 1951. But our timber stocks are depleting, and we are coming close to what's called peak wood, or the point at which we haven't replanted enough timber to sustain the demand that we have. And also, kind of shockingly, a lot of our hardwood timber is wood fuel, so essentially it's burned, what we consume. There's buildings like this now that I think we need to start to question. If our timber is so rare and so precious, and the ecosystems our forests support so valuable, every time we fell trees to make products and buildings, we need to be using those resources as efficiently as possible, using that timber to make lean and lightweight buildings. And what we plan to do next is to apply these ideas to a building to which we'll be erecting in Dolby Forest, a new classroom building, hopefully, which will demonstrate the different applications of British timbers in construction, both the diseased ones, things like larch and ash, and the climate resilient timber species like Douglas fir, and how they can come together to form contemporary building systems with applications at scale. So as we move forward, we can ensure that reforestation and afforestation serves us and our landscapes and ecosystems and our soils ecologically. Because we believe now that the future of a decarbonised built environment depends on these disconnected industries working together to facilitate change. We need to ensure that the competing demands on our landscape can be reconciled in a post-carbon future. And so we'll be looking at what it would mean for our landscape to draw more from agroforestry practices, bringing greater biodiversity into the landscape alongside small and mixed rotational farming, with sustainable forestry practices which facilitate the development of productive woodland and national parkland. Our current mode of practices can't support the kinds of futures we envision for ourselves and for those to come. And so as architects and citizens, we have to really think our relationship to the land and to each other to develop new forms of material practice and culture and economy. Thank you very much. So a little bit over.
Thank you very much, Summer. Do you want to talk about this list? Is this people you've consulted?
Yeah, sorry, this is just to acknowledge all the different collaborators we've had in this project so far. And so these are people we've been talking to and working with on Constructive Land.
I wondered if, James, if you want to respond to Summer.
Yeah, that was great. Really good talk. And yes, there was quite a lot of points of intersection, I think, between Summer's presentation and mine. So, you know, I think there is in society a bit of a dichotomy about whether you like spiky conifers grown for primarily timber production purposes or not. There's quite an antipathy in the UK towards that sort of forestry, but the reality is that sort of forestry is sustaining the timber production which is in demand in the society in the UK. It's the place that produces the sawn timber for houses, it produces newsprint, it produces pulp for packaging, it produces chipboard, it produces sterling board for construction. So yes, you can have an opinion about whether it's a good sort of tree or a not good sort of tree. The UK is somewhat depleted in conifer tree species because of the accidents of post-glacial retreat and things like that. You know, so there is really only one commercially exploitable species, conifer species in the UK that's native to the UK, and that's the Scots pine. And the position at the beginning of the 20th century was that the UK was one of the most deforested countries on the planet. And that was as a result of agriculture, really, and over millennia of clearing at small scale and then larger scale. And ultimately, the hillsides that were planted with spruce predominantly, and the uplands had been sheep farming immediately before that. And those were very impoverished places because of that kind of farming that was practiced there. And a lot of places that were planted back then wouldn't be planted now. So a lot of the peaty soils and deep peats wouldn't be planted now, and those kinds of soils haven't been planted for 30 or 40 years now.
Thank you. I don't know if there are kind of questions from the audience. I have this idea of peak timber is a bit worrying.
Yeah.
I wonder how we meet it and whether Forestry England is meeting it, or also beyond maybe publicly owned forest, whether there is the government is putting pressure on landowners to engage with this issue.
Well, the government isn't putting pressure other than pressuring them with large amounts of money they would like to give them in exchange for planting trees. So it's more carrot than stick. However, it's very, very difficult to find spaces in England because it's such a populated country. It's so valued in terms of the farmland. It's very difficult to find spaces to plant trees at any great scale. But we are actually in the middle of in recent times, one of the most generous government budgets for tree planting, a thing called the Nature for Climate Fund. Remains to be seen whether it's having an impact. We at Forestry England is planting. It is trying to expand the area, but it's only by a few percent of our 253,000 hectares. And even that is a struggle to acquire the land and to get the permissions to plant it. And that's the same sort of difficulty which is experienced in most places throughout England and a lot of places in Scotland and Wales too. Scotland's doing better.
Kieran, do you want to come in? Thank you, James. Kieran, do you want to come in and ask the question directly?
Sure. So I've been really curious. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So I just wanted to ask about, I was looking at the FSC documentation, and I'm kind of really curious about the ecology and like farmed environments. And like I've heard there's some interesting things about when there's rotational monocultures that the ecology like will move into the different zones. So if you do it, like if you give them passages, when you clear one area, the ecology will move to the next area. And then I've also heard about different things about when you have mixed farming and you remove some of the trees and the impact that has on the ecology. And I've never been able to find anything that's kind of, because one of the arguments against timber is often that it affects ecology, and I've just never been able to really get a sense of what that's like. I was wondering if either of you knew much about that.
Big subject. So first of all, the FSC thing. So FSC they're a global movement towards sustainable forest management, and the way they operate, they have a standard which has all the principles in it around which defines sustainable forest management for them, which are applicable throughout the world. And what often happens is that individual countries will develop their own standard in line with the FSC standard, and FSC basically have the final say in whether it matches or it doesn't match. So in the UK, we have a thing called the UK Woodland Assurance Standard, which I've put a link to in the chat. So that's how consistency is sought from FSC, and it's basically the same from the other certification initiatives. In terms of the ecology of woodland and what happens when you either move that woodland or you manage it by removing some of the trees in a rotation, it depends very much on how you do it. So the bigger the patch of trees you clear, the more like, or rather the less like a woodland environment it's going to be for the few years after you've cleared those trees before new ones establish and go back. So the ecology will change, obviously, quite starkly in that time. But with forests which are connected well across landscapes, and you have a mosaic of different management activities in time across that forest landscape, you would expect almost all of the ecology, the mobile things to move. Even plants are quite mobile. Even soil fungus is quite mobile, but in relative timescales, the most mobile things would be birds that can just get up and fly some miles to somewhere else. But you're right, the principle of connected landscapes and corridors for animals and plants to move through is a very good one. That's what we would aim for in a modern forest design.
Just one quick follow-up is that so again, like whenever you have discussions with steel or concrete or timber, like the ecology impact always comes up, and I was really curious, but I always thought it's really interesting that the wood industry has an FSC. It has its own high standard that it holds itself to, and I was wondering if you knew if there was one for any of the other industries at all, like of a similar kind of standard.
Yeah, I think for concrete and steel, it's pretty difficult for them to produce a standard which claims sustainability, basically, because they're based on extractive use of raw materials from the earth.
Okay.
So no, they have standards for the best standard of steel or concrete production, and there are ways of producing concrete and steel which are a lower carbon impact than others, but they're still a pretty high carbon impact. And it's not to say that forestry doesn't. It's not to say that forestry doesn't have a carbon impact either. We could do things in forest management that release a lot of carbon from the soil inadvertently, too much disturbance, and even the machinery that goes out there and drains, cultivates, carries plants out, they all burn diesel. So nothing is without an impact.
Thanks.
Summer, I'm curious to bring you in. I'm curious because you make such a slightly urgent case, no? Like there's a sense of urgency in it. And you have a quite strong network of maybe allies. That's the last slide. Who do you think needs to hear it most? Where do you think the audience for this work is to affect real change?
I think, well, I guess there's two ends of the spectrum depending on who we're talking to. I mean, I think one of the things to get across is maybe that we have taken for granted, I think, that just using lots of trees was a good solution to using lots of concrete, and the maths doesn't quite bear that out as a good solution to the problem. I see there's like relative goods and relative evils. So yeah, to some extent, I think the audience is architects and designers. For us generally to have a better understanding of the consequences of what we do is crucial. But also there's a conversation that we're looking to have with, DEFRA, for example, around the relative choices we make between farming use and forestry use of land, and how different subsidies have propped up different systems, and the trade-offs that we're making. Because at the moment, as James was mentioning, the drive to plant more trees is being dealt with by just throwing money at the private sector, but not the kind of logistical and regulatory frameworks which make that difficult haven't gone away. You still have to get planning permission. People still don't like it when you plant trees near them, generally speaking, especially if they're conifers. There's like a cultural resistance to trees, which is strange. But it's because we're used to the impact of forestry being in mainland Europe. And it's more kind of, I think, just generally that we need to see more the impact of what it is that we say we want. We say we want more things made of paper. Cardboard packaging is better than plastic packaging. But the reality, what that means is that you have to live within those landscapes which still continue to work. And we have lost the habit of that.
I absolutely agree with that, Summer. And it's worth bearing in mind that the word plantation is a bit pejorative, and it conjures up dark places, serried ranks of Sitka spruce. And I think contemporary forest management is turning many of those forests which were planted in the 70s, 60s, 50s, 80s into places which are much more diverse and interesting for all sorts of reasons. But the thing to remember about plantation forestry in many parts of the world is those can be the places which are taking the pressure off natural forests, because hectare for hectare, they're much more productive than natural forests. And provided they've been put in a place which hasn't cut down native forests, they can be a very positive part of the forestry landscape in a country.
Ian, I see you've left a few questions and comments in the chat. Would you like to come in and ask the questions directly? No, you disappeared. Oh, are you there? Sorry.
Yeah, thanks very much. Really, really interesting. Yeah, the first one was one for James, really. I was just interested to know what role Forest England had or might have in kind of regulating carbon credits between the sort of government-sponsored schemes and the private sector, search for sort of accelerating search for carbon credit sites, really driven, the sort of ESG investment model, which is accelerating, sort of creating this gold rush of stacked levies, carbon credits on biodiversity credits and catchment credits and even nutrient credits down here in the Solent. Are you kind of acting as a kind of regulator in the middle of all of this, James?
No, so we're not regulators. We are more project developers. So we're very like a private landowner when it comes to a project and how we might access finance, which is alternative to just cash finance. Interestingly, we are already active with nutrient offset credits in the Solent catchment, and it's very lucrative too, actually. Wish we could get some more of those. By contrast, Woodland Carbon is, in theory, it looks really attractive, but the current rules for Woodland Carbon projects is you can only have Woodland Carbon money if your project would not go ahead otherwise, which is the principle of additionality. So whilst I get that, and for society in general, it's a great thing that money spent on carbon credits only goes to the places where it really makes a difference. For the woodland manager and owner, it's a bit frustrating because it feels like the bar is constantly being pushed up to accessing funding, which you could then use to plant other woodlands elsewhere. It's all about cash flow and having enough money to invest in capital projects. So planting a new woodland is very much a money-hungry activity. Even the most out there, single-purpose, productive forestry plantation is going to take decades to produce anything in the way of cash. So you must have a big lump of cash to start off with to acquire that land, either by lease or purchase, to plant the trees on it, to tend the trees on it, all the way up to the point where you can actually harvest them and sell them to an end user.
Yeah, thank you.
But it's a really interesting subject. And I think there are many platforms for various sorts of ecosystem services payments, which are just teetering on the edge of maturity at the moment, which I think could be really beneficial to the cause of tree planting throughout the rest of this century.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think they're going to align in a slightly terrifying way, if I'm quite honest, really, and trying to make sure it doesn't spin out of control entirely is going to be part of the job for all of us, I think, really. But thank you.
I have colleagues who regulate that, who would regulate that stuff. So I will pass on your concerns to them.
If I could just, then my second question was really for Summer, if that's all right. It was just, I'm based here on the Isle of Wight, a UNESCO World Biosphere Reserve, which we're very proud of. We have no deer. Well, we have a few that escaped from the deer front, but
lucky you.
So
that's great.
Natural regeneration, we're very keen on making best use of it. And I just wondered how you saw fostering natural regeneration within the kind of strategies, policies, and programs that you're talking about.
You mean sort of natural regeneration within forests, kind of allowing them kind of young trees to come up?
Yes, and on land that is just taken out of other forms of production and allowed to become
to wild itself. I guess over time, I'm not an expert at all, so I only have layman's opinions on the subject. But my opinion is that to some extent, the ideas around rewilding, let's say broadly, which isn't exactly what you're talking about, but maybe is associated, assumes that human intervention is inherently negative and that the best way to achieve our goals is to sort of entirely step back And I think, you know, there is a role for natural regeneration alongside management, and I expect that that would be necessary to cultivate the kind of balances we want. You know, you don't have deer, so maybe in the context of sort of mainland forestry, intervention at scale is really crucial. But you might have squirrels, I don't know, and they're a real pain. I think for kind of trying to start young forests and allow young trees to grow into maturity. But some of the more interesting models of forestry that we're looking at, I think the kind of continuous cover models, which, as James has already said, is more of a model that Forestry England is looking at generally anyway. You know, clear felling is falling out of use as a practice. They work with kind of mature trees, younger trees, and even kind of a forest garden model where you have you know, shrubs and, you know, like smaller trees and fruit growing at low level, and they're all really exciting models. But I think the evidence at the moment is that they are lower yield, and we're kind of exploring, I suppose, how you get all the things you want out of your land and make it as sustainable as possible. And there are just, yeah, I mean, we had a conversation with Dr. Eleanor Chew at Forestry England. She does the natural capital work for Forestry England, and we were interested to hear from her that it is bearing out, even in natural capital terms, that having some very highly managed, densely forested, high yield land, and then allowing your other forests to exist in the way that they have done, is better ecologically than trying to have a lot of or more of the kind of low intervention forests, because you allow different ecosystems to flourish in different places. And maybe that's the kind of ecosystem that you could nurture on the Isle of Wight.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think the opportunities for kind of spontaneous urban woodland from natural regeneration in particular is incredibly important to create new recreational and kind of well-being resources, I suppose, really. You can get you can concentrate an enormous amount of positive human activity into a sort of diverse, even a kind of scrubby thicket kind of emerging woodland on one field. You can get so much more out of it than just having a field, you know, which if you can see from one side to the other, it's a fairly all or nothing experience. But if you've got to kind of crawl through a maze of funny little tracks and badger runs to explore a field because it's covered in spontaneous growth, it just becomes a fascinating place for all sorts of other reasons. So yeah, thank you very much.
If I may, I can't help but have my tuppence worth on the rewilding thing. So we in Forestry England studiously avoid the wee bit of rewilding, because it's a somewhat subjective allusion to a point in time ago that you're aiming for. But we are very happy to talk about forest wilding. And in our biodiversity delivery programme within Forestry England, we're aiming to establish 12,000 hectares of core wild area over the next 5-10 years. And these will be forests which will still produce timber and produce many other things, still be there for people, but they'll also have a lot more in the way of natural processes evident in their regeneration and their management, particularly grazing, probably with hardy cattle, which we hope would stimulate quite a lot of natural regeneration, actually, not just of tree and shrub species, but also the ground flora, which do particularly well under the feet of poaching cattle.
Thank you. There is Andrew Stringer from Forestry England will be with us next time, who talks about forest wilding. So it's a nice moment
Brilliant.
to pick that up. And also Eleanor will join us on the 15th to talk about the resilient forest and probably go more into depth into the natural capital. But we have one more question from Catalina, and I don't know if you're comfortable to say it out loud, Catalina, because I think it's maybe a nice turn towards the end of the session, towards labor.
Okay, I'm sorry I cannot turn my camera on, but yeah, I wanted to ask you both. Thank you for your presentations. I just wanted to ask about the human aspect involved in these initiatives. That is, I mean, we generally talk about forest and species and tree species, but we rarely talk about the, let's say, human labor involved or like programs that follow wilding projects, or so I was wondering, and I think this question came up when I was listening, when I think it was you, sorry, in the presentation when you mentioned about, or it was Summer that made this emphasis on timber being brought from abroad, and we never really talk how that timber is been somehow cultivated, who is involved, and yeah, so the question around labor, and I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on that, and if in your case, Summer, more specifically, let's say this urgency also comes with an urgency of rethinking not only soil relationships, but social and labor relation, like human capital. So whatever you can expand on, I'll be grateful. Thank you.
Well, I've got my, thanks, Kathleen. I've got my forestry statistics in front of me, so I'll bash a few of those off. Pretty small employment in the forestry sector in the UK, really relatively. So it's about 18,000 jobs in forest management in its broadest sense, about 7,000 working in sawmills, and about 5,000 working in chipboard and sterling board plants. So it is really quite small. What that is completely eclipsed by is the, if you like, the non-market benefit which people get just from visiting and enjoying woodlands. And in Forestry England woodlands, we do a survey every year, which of course comes up with an estimate, not an absolute figure, but we are up to 296 million visits, not visitors, visits, because our visitors tend to visit many, many times each. But it is a huge number of visits that we're getting. And so the recreational benefit, the value, the natural capital value, is way bigger than the employment benefit, which is, but that is important in some remote rural places.
Summer, did you look into labor practices also abroad? Possibly?
Yeah, it's one of the things that we haven't touched on yet, because labor, people and animals, I guess, is next on our list, animals and creatures. But it's something that we talk about quite a lot. I think it's really good that you asked the question, Katerina. I guess we have been existing in the research within the kind of British forestry landscape. But in some of the work we're doing in the practice, I guess we've come across questions recently about how we guarantee that timber sourced globally is being done not just in sustainable ways, but that the kind of labor practices are things that we could stand by, and how we follow the way we work here in other places. And it's very difficult. It means that we're choosing to use less of those materials where the information is opaque to us, because it's very hard to find out, actually. But yeah, it's a really important element of the question, and yeah, we don't have much to say on it yet, but hopefully we will over the next few months.
Andreas, I'm afraid I'm going to need to go now. I have the sense of a taxi arriving to take me to the train station.
It's amazing you can call a taxi in the forest you're in.
Yeah, superpowers.
Thank you so much, James. And maybe that's a good prompt to draw the session to an end. Thank you so much, James. Thank you so much, Summer. And everyone in the background, Joy, Zoe. We reconvene on the 1st of June with Andrew Stringer and our own Heather Barnett, arts and scientist, to look at forest wilding, not rewilding. And yeah, I hope to see you on the 1st.
Thank you so much again for the invite. Highly recommend Andrew and Ellie. They're part of my team and they're absolutely brilliant. They'll put me in the shade.
Thank you all, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.